to Trusty Chords, the podcast which aims to celebrate music and those that create it. When it comes to the Australian alternative rock scene, it's pretty hard to look past the likes of Screamfeeder. After all, they've been around for over 30 years now, and whenever anyone imagines an Australian alternative band, it's a band like Screamfeeder they're thinking of. Loud, melodic, critically acclaimed, and commercially overlooked, Screamfeeder commands an intense fanbase, and you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone with a bad word to say about them. While records like 1996's Kitten Licks are a brilliant example of the sort of music that both Screamfeeder and Australia were putting out, albums like Flower, Burn Out Your Name, Fill Yourself With Music, and Rocks on the Soul are firm favourites as well. In the 2000s, however, Screamfeeder remained a little bit quiet, and though the band never broke up, Tim, Kellie, Dean, and Darek weren't really doing a whole heap, with other musical projects filling that void. In 2017, they returned with a new album, their first in 14 years, and in 2022, they released their latest record, 5 Rooms. More recently, however, they've been surprisingly busy. After all, there's been loads of amazing shows. There's been a book on Kitten Licks by authors Ben Green and Ian Rogers, and Tim and Kellie even have the Ending Goes On Forever podcast. But that's not all, because now Screamfeeder are also readying the Demolition compilation, 100 demo recordings from between 1992 and 2022. Don't get too keen, however, because Tim warns you it's all filler, no killer, even for die-hard Screamfeeder fans. But you know what? I could talk about Screamfeeder for hours, or Tim could do that for me. Thankfully, he's on hand to do so because he's my guest on this week's episode. Fortunate, huh? Anyway, I strongly urge you to check out Screamfeeder's brilliant discography, and once you're done giving that a spin, have a listen to our chat, and I'll see you at the end of the episode for some general housekeeping. Tim Steward, thank you very much for joining this episode of Trusty Chords.
Thanks for having me.
So, for those who might not recognise your name, can you give me a quick few words on who you are and why we're chatting today?
Well, I guess the best reason people might know my name is because I play in a Brisbane band called Screamfeeder, have done for the last, 33 years or something crazy like that. And I think that's my, claim to fame, as they say.
So, that's a pretty good claim to fame to have, really. You've obviously had a lot of projects over the years, which we will touch on. But okay. I guess what I'd love to do at the start of these podcasts is sort of go back to a time where a love of music first formed. So for you, Tim, do you have a recollection of your earliest memory of when music first resonated with you?
Well, not a specific day or time, but I definitely remember as a kid, maybe I was about 9 or 10, my mum would play me like the Beatles and Buddy Holly and music like that, which is really very classy, well-written pop stuff. So that sort of planted a seed. And then shortly after that, punk kind of hit in because I grew up in England. And when that happened, almost before I'd heard the music, I knew that it was for me and I knew that I was going to like it. And because I was so young and it was hard to hear music back then, you basically relied on the radio. It took me a little while to hear it. And as soon as I did, I was like, oh my God, this is what I've been waiting for. The eagle has landed,
So, you obviously mentioned listening to like the Beatles and stuff when you were quite young, but you're also mentioning punk there. Were there any sort of specific artists you sort of remember listening to in those early days that really spoke to you?
Well, I remember this funny period that was the transition between the two. So like in about, it must have been 1976, 1977, I was finding music like Jimi Hendrix and Thin Lizzy, say, which is more like it's rock, but it's poppy as well. So it sort of ticked both boxes for me. And then I think the first real punk band I must have heard was probably almost certainly the Sex Pistols. So as soon as I heard that, I was like, oh shit, this is fucking amazing, Because I was 11 at the time, and it was all my mates were into it at school, and it was mind-blowing, literally. I never heard anything like it.
So it almost sounds like the Sex Pistols had the same impact on you that they did with the folks at that Manchester Lesser Free Trade Hall gig, where pretty much everyone who listened to that day, they all form a band and just have that love of music explode from there.
And it's so amazing looking back on that period now. Like that moment in music changed the world forever. Like it's incredible.
So then for you, when did a love of music actually transform into playing music? When did you sort of first pick up an instrument?
Well, I had guitar lessons as a kid, just playing, on a nylon string acoustic guitar. And then when I was 20, I was living in Australia and I went back to England for an extended trip to live with my dad again. And a friend of mine was selling an electric guitar, and like I'd always sort of tossed around the idea of forming my own band. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to buy this electric guitar. I bought it off him for £20. I brought it back to Australia, and I was a super rudimentary guitarist. Like I really knew nothing basically apart from a few shapes. And I just fell in with a bunch of young kids in Townsville who were out of school and doing radio shows at this local community radio station, 4TTT. And they were as naive and useless at music as I was, but we were all just like burning with enthusiasm. We had plenty of time on our hands. None of us worked. And it was like this fertile breeding ground of like, let's just form a bunch of bands.
So obviously, if none of you really have, I guess, talent, that those early bands didn't sound the best, did they? Or was it sort of more a case of ambition overtook talent?
Well, no. I mean, some of the bands in Townsville, the guys had enough talent to make a band that actually sounded good, and they had good singers and stuff. My band was terrible for at least the first year of our life, but we were in love with it. We didn't care. We were having a great old time.
And what was that band's name?
Well, the very first band name we called ourselves was actually the Psycho Skate Smurfs on Smack, and then it transformed a few months later into the Lethal Injections, and that changed about a year or 8 months later into the Madmen, which became the precursor to Screamfeeder.
That was actually my next question for you, because most people would predominantly know you from Screamfeeder, but before that there was the Madmen. So how did that progression sort of happen? How did you go from the Madmen to Screamfeeder?
Well, we were pretty happy as the Madmen, and we must have run for 2 or 3 years under that name, but we had a few releases and we did a bit of touring and played in Sydney and stuff like that. And we moved to Brizzy, and times were changing fast. Like when we moved to Brisbane, you know, the seeds of the grunge thing was starting to happen. There was a lot more English and American indie rock that we were tuning into via, you know, the radio or the record shops in Brisbane. And it was you know, especially coming from Townsville, because we were in total backwater up there. We hadn't heard any of the new music. We were like running on shit that was 5 years old. And we heard all this new stuff, and we were like, oh, wow, the music's really changing. And around that time, we got our first interest from a record company. And amongst one of the things they said to us was, look, it'd be good if you change your name. And we'd sort of been thinking about it. So at that point, we were like, okay, let's commit. It's not too late. Let's change the name.
Right. So where did the name Screamfeeder come from then?
So this is a funny, was not funny, it's a very boring story, but I was actually going to do a podcast episode on the Screamfeeder podcast about the name, because everyone asks me all the time. And I'll tell you, because it's the stupidest story. In England, I used to go fishing heaps, just in like lakes, rivers, canals, that kind of thing. And over there for bait, you often use maggots. Like you can go to the fishing shop and buy like a container of maggots, and they're all bred and stuff. And there's this piece of tackle which is like a plastic tube with holes in it and a bit of lead along the bottom. So it's like a big sinker, but you fill it up with the maggots and you cast it out. So they crawl all over the bottom of the river, and they attract the fish, and then the fish takes the one that's on your hook. And it's called a swim feeder.
Right. I honestly don't think I ever would have actually thought, you know, the answer to that question lies in, you know, your average bait shop. I would have thought it would have almost been something sort of fanciful, like it was a name you saw on a guitar pedal or something.
Yeah, there it is.
Like, yeah, but that's fascinating actually. I'm trying to think of if any other bands have done that, but I don't believe they have.
Well, they probably have. I mean, band names are so random and weird and odd, and like we were scouring around for ages. It took us months to find that name, and as soon as we did, we were like, "Oh my god, yeah, we got it. We got the name."
Were there any other ones in contention then? If Screamfeeder was like, you know, the one you went with, was there anything else that was in contention?
I can't remember any that were. Like honestly, we would literally get on our bikes or go on the bus into town and go to the state library and just look at random books and look at, you know, history stuff or war stuff or science stuff, just trying to find a good phrase, and we came up with nothing.
Well, I'm glad you picked Screamfeeder, not, you know, Bus Stop 17 or something like that.
Yeah. And I mean, there's been several times over the years where we thought, oh my God, Screamfeeder is the stupidest name ever. Let's change it. And then we've gone full circle and come back and went, no, we can't. It's our brand now. You know, people know it.
Of course. Yeah, you're you're sort of married to it now after all these years. So when both of the Madmen and Screamfeeder sort of, when the Madmen started, you started mentioning having this sort of like sound. Sorry, let me sort of rephrase that. When you first started playing music, you had like a bit of an idea of the sound you're sort of going into that evolved to the Madmen, and then you got Screamfeeder. So when Screamfeeder first really was going off in earnest, was there any sort of, I guess, sound that you guys were trying to I guess, achieve at all? Because a lot of bands will sort of attempt to mimic their heroes, but given Screamfeeder had sort of emerged from this other, band name and this other sort of history, it feels like you would have already been trying to find your own sound, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, yeah, it totally makes sense. Well, the funny thing about it is that when we were young and we used to listen to music, like we basically, Kellie and I especially, and Tony, we grew up on Hooskadoo, right? They're our big thing. And they have a specific sound across their albums. The sound changes a little, the guitars get a little sort of like more gritty and then less gritty again, stuff like that. But when we listened to the music, we perceived that the guitars were like ultra loud and ultra distorted to the point of insanity. And really what we were hearing was just a well-mixed record where you could just actually hear the guitars and everything was separated enough that it sounded great. And we just mistook that for just having to go all out, go on 10 with everything basically. And so all the way through, like until probably our third album, we just were obsessed with having the guitars ruling everything and just having the whole tonal range taken over by guitar. The guitar had to be fat and bassy and trebly and mid-rangey all at the same time. And honestly, it was one of the most dumb things because I look back on the recordings now and I'm like, the fucking guitars are just ridiculous in a lot of cases. We should have just let them breathe a little and given the other instruments some space. But you can't know these things until you've made the mistakes, right?
Exactly. Plus, I mean, at that sort of time as well, like music just felt so, I think of the right word to say, but it sort of felt like all happening at once. There was not really sort of much room, I guess, for space as well. I mean, you did have sort of, I guess, bands like the Pixies and Nirvana who were trying to do that sort of quiet, loud dynamic, but it really felt like every instrument had to play as loud as possible at any given moment to sort of make yourself
exactly
heard.
right. And you speak to Cal and she's like, I wanted to be the busiest, loudest bass player in the world. She literally said that,
Yeah. Well, she's done good work, that's for sure.
I agree. Yeah, yeah.
But something I always find fascinating also is like when you see a band release their first album and you can see those sort of same threads, or if you will, those patterns forming that continue throughout their whole career. I know, a bit of a plug there. But this, I mean, I listened to like the Flower album, for example, and I can still hear parts of the music that you guys make today. And like, do you feel that as well, or do you feel that there has been a lot of evolution that is sort of that you've sort of evolved away as you've gone from those earliest recordings? As you get older and evolve musically, there would be change. But do you still feel that there are those elements that were present in those earliest recordings?
Yeah, probably like the sort of specific ringing, sort of chimey guitar tone that Hooskadoo were famous for, and they kind of pioneered. That's still something I find myself doing and I'm drawn towards it. And even like we went to practice last night and Kellie wasn't able to come to practice. So it's just two guitars and drums. And it was actually awesome because both guitarists, me and Darek, we could actually hear our guitars way more. And we were really enjoying, just making slightly louder and great sounds and, just feeling that thing. And I think that particular guitar approach is always in me and I can't really ever escape from it.
Yeah, I mean, plus, like, much like the name as well, it's sort of something that's become so associated with like almost yourself as a brand, hasn't it?
Yeah, totally.
So that's what people expect when they hear Screamfeeder or they hear Tim playing.
Yeah, and we've got a few periods, like there's a couple of albums where we kind of backed off a little and played cleaner guitars and stuff, which I love doing and I love listening to now. And, went down varying degrees of success.
I mean, actually, that's incidentally, I think one song I remember hearing from you guys years ago, I think it was a B-side, which was very sort of experimental feeling. I might be totally off the mark. I may need to edit this bit out. I think it was the song "Oh My God, It's Full of Stars."
Oh yeah, okay.
I think that was a B-side, wasn't it? And I remember hearing that and thinking, this feels so different, but it feels so still Screamfeeder.
Right. Wow. Okay, that's interesting.
And yeah, I really don't know how to describe it, and I haven't listened to it for a while. But just as you were saying that, it's sort of like it tickled something in my memory.
Yeah,
I thought,
wow.
hang on, I'm feeling that now.
It's funny because at the moment I'm putting together a demos collection for the band, and we've got a ton of stuff which is instrumental, like there's no singing, but again, it just sounds like us, obviously. But yeah.
And obviously, I do need to touch on Screamfeeder of the '90s again because it's such an amazing era for the band and for music in general. But how did that era actually feel for you guys? How did it feel for this sort of humble little band to be sort of in demand and to sort of be having albums like, Kitten Licks, which were just sort of huge on like things like Triple J, and you guys were playing festivals all over and a very in-demand band, feels.
Yeah, I guess we always looked at that as work rather than treats and fun. And well, it was always fun, of course, but we always looked at it as in, okay, this is what we've got to do to get to the next step. This is what we've got to do to get to the next step. We're in demand. We just get in the van, we go out and do it. And it was like a work ethic, you know what I mean? So like it was, all three of us in the band were very, very aligned with that in the 90s, especially. Like we just knew that we had to work as hard as we could. And, you know, I guess there was an element where we were super grateful to be getting the radio attention, and we realized how lucky we were, but it was certainly not the main feeling.
Was there any, I guess, specific moment at which you guys sort of thought, you know what, all of this hard work and treating this band like work is sort of like, it's become worth it? Was there any sort of moment that sticks out for you?
Honestly, I don't remember having that feeling, even though we enjoyed every day of the band. Like we loved it. There was no point where the band became tedious, boring, or actually hard work, as in a not a good way. So there was no real moment where we kind of went, I don't know, like maybe there was, but not really in a very overt kind of way.
Well, I mean, I think that just goes to show that every day was a highlight for you guys, clearly.
I think it was, you know, we'd achieved what we set out to do, but we weren't sitting around sort of slapping each other on the back about it. We were just doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, otherwise you end up just resting on your laurels and you don't end up evolving at all. And you don't end up sort of making, you know, new and exciting albums. You just make the same album every time.
Yeah.
So around, you know, the mid-2000s, Screamfeedr weren't exactly the most prolific band. You were all sort of, you know, working casually in some other projects and everything, while the band was still sort of playing shows here and there. But for the uninitiated, I guess, what was the reason that there was a little bit of a slowdown? And I guess then, you know, what was it that meant we had a 14-year wait between studio albums as well?
Well, it was a number of things. So in about, must have been 04 or so, Dean was like, guys, this is killing me. You know, we're going on tour and there's fewer and fewer people coming each time, because this was the point at which file sharing started, streaming started. It was a shock to the music system, you know, like, because it used to be like you'd go on tour and people would come to the gigs because that was their entertainment, and they'd come along and they'd be fucking mad for it. And everything suddenly changed and everyone was sitting at home getting into the internet, and that shook the structure, as it were. And I think even though when we put out Take You Apart in like 03, we had a ton of radio airplay off that, and that we toured okay off that. But honestly, after that, we started realizing that we're probably touring too much, and we'd sort of forgotten to focus on the next step up rather than just the ever revolving hamster wheel of going on tour and putting singles out. So it sort of it meant that the band more or less got pushed into a corner by our own doing, and it became a little less rewarding, I guess. We were still loving the music and each other's company, but when you go on tour and like you come home and you still haven't got any money, it sucks, you know. And like there's a half a room full of people there instead of a room full, especially compared to how it had been a few years prior. So Dean was like, yeah, I can't really do this anymore, and he wanted to pull out, and so we got another drummer for a while, and she was okay, and then I can't remember how that ended, but it kind of just got to the point where we were just like exhausted by it and we needed to have a breather. And so we kind of just backed off for ages, actually. And we did a few random things in the late noughties, but very sporadic.
And then I guess, how did that feel for you guys? Like, you know, did it actually feel like, you know, this is the refresher that we needed? Like, this is the break that was very necessary? Or the whole time were you sort of like, you know, checking your watch, tapping your foot, sort of, let's get back on stage?
No, we were just like, we're done with it. We were tired with it for a while, you know. We didn't even put much thought into it. We weren't like, okay, let's have 2 years off and then come back to it fresh. We didn't do anything like that. We were just like, oh, we're done. Let's do some other stuff for a while. You know, it was just, yeah, we didn't plan it. We just kind of put it to bed for a while.
Yeah. And then some of the music you worked on in that time, like there was, I'm trying to remember, I just lost it in my head because there was some solo stuff. There was We All Want To and The Watts, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Am I missing anything there at all? Or
well, for me, that was the big three things for sure. Kellie did a number of smaller bands. There was one called The White Mansions and one called The Warm Guns. So between me and Kellie, we had 4 bands all starting with W. That's crazy, right? And
actually
and she did a solo album and various other stuff. So we were all pretty busy. Yeah.
I mean, how did that feel? Because I assume that, having been focused on Screamfeeder for so long, moving away to any other focus would have been a little bit different, right?
Oh, it was a shock to the system, like because we'd been playing together for so long, we just took it for granted that everything in a band worked the way we knew it to work. And so when we went into another band with other people, we're like, holy shit, the way we go to practice is different. The way we go to the airport is different. The way we write songs is different. This is nuts. And it was such a shock.
Mm. So I guess what was it that also actually sort of I guess what was the impetus for you guys actually sort of, I guess, not the word reforming, but getting back together and like performing and playing and writing together in earnest?
Well, we actually played in about 2010 or 11, I want to say, a gig that we thought was going to be our final gig ever in Brisbane, and we publicised it as such. And what was happening was Dean was looking to move overseas on a semi-permanent sort of basis. But 6 months later, he came back because his parent, either him or his partner had a parent that was going down, and they had to move back to Australia. And so he came back, and then in about 2011, we got offered the Bob Mould support at the Zoo in Brisbane, and we played, the three of us, and it was a rad gig. We had a great time, and we kind of shook ourselves down. We're like, oh, hang on, we've got that thing that we've all got together that we can still do. Let's not forget how to do that, and let's not forget to do it. And then it wasn't too long after that we started having chats with Poison City, who put us on a couple of gigs in Melbourne, which were great, and they put the idea on the table of reissuing the old albums on vinyl.
And then going from reissuing those old albums, we've then had new albums arrive since. And how has it actually felt to be, releasing new music again? Because I also imagine that for a long time, especially when you're playing new shows again, there would have been a desire from fans to, just hear all the old music. But at the same time, you don't just want to remain stagnant. You sort of want to evolve and keep making music. So I guess these past 7 years sort of have allowed you to sort of, release new music, write new music, and also stretch your legs while looking back to the past and doing that fan service thing as well, right?
Yeah, it's a funny one, the whole, because I've fall into the trap as well. Like I'm watching bands and I'm standing there going, oh, I wish they played the old stuff. It's like, and then I go, oh, damn it, I'm that guy, But everyone's like that because when the band's been around 30 years plus, you do want to hear the old stuff because that's why you like the band, And sure, there's a small handful of people who come to the new material first, but mostly not. And so, putting out new records, I feel if you're a band, writing songs and recording is one of the things you just do. So you just do it. But it's so different because like back in the 90s and noughties, when it was time to record an album, we traveled to a place, record an album in a specific amount of time, come home again, the album would get released. It was so simple. Now, the last two, we've recorded it both in Brisbane, both, where members of the band can just drift in and out over the couple of weeks we record, over the 3 weeks, whatever it might be. And it's a way less focused, which is a bit of a shame because when you go somewhere as a group and you're mega rehearsed and you're all ready for it, you really come out with great shit. But we did okay with these two albums, and but it didn't have the sort of immediacy and the urgency of the older recordings. But also that's because, we're all on computer now and it's like much easier to file around and try things rather than press record on the tape and you have to get it right,
So when you look at these new albums, do you sort of, I guess, look at them with a little bit of, again, not sadness, but sort of, do you sort of look at them and sort of say, oh, that they aren't quite the same way we would have done the old stuff? Like, do you still view them in the same league as like any of the old stuff? Or is it sort of, do you sort of view it as sort of like the old and new?
At the end of the day, like the only thing that I rate is the songwriting. So like if the songs are good and they're performed okay, that's fine with me. So, sure, whenever I put out an album, I'm pretty critical of it for about 6 months and then I stop caring and I just enjoy it for what it is. And it's all fine. Like, I listen to Pop Guilt now, and Pop Guilt was sort of always the one I was a bit like, no, it's a bit overproduced, it's a bit slick, it's very clean and tidy and whatnot. And I listen to it now and I don't care. Like, I just listen to the songs and I enjoy them. So, yeah.
Oh, it's a brilliant record. I mean, there's no need to worry too much about about any sort of overproduction that you may feel is there. But actually, it's also quite funny that you mentioned the idea of sort of just before mentioning like going to see a band and sort of being like, play the old stuff. Like Sunday night, I was actually in Brisbane for a tour. I was there to see Tism actually.
Oh wow!
As you can see by the poster behind me.
Yeah,
probably. And the entire time, I mean, long time one of my favorite bands, but the whole time I'm just like, all right, do we really need, all this
Yeah.
new stuff? Let's go
Yeah.
back to the classics sort of thing. And I hate feeling that way
I do too.
I'm also someone who feels that, artists should have the license to do what they want to do. They
Yeah.
shouldn't just be beholden to servicing the fans and only playing the hits.
Mm.
But that's my little rant for a bit.
Well, I guess the thing is, honestly, the sad reality of it is that once you've done that thing where you've stopped the mad rush of album after album and you've had your break and then you come back, that puts you in a different league. Like, we're actually a band that's now basically trading on our old stuff largely. And it is what it is, and I'm not crying about it. It's fine because it actually warms my heart to know that there's people out there who care about the old stuff enough and they want to pay to come and see it and hang out with us and all the stuff. So, it is what it is. It's fine.
Yeah. And I guess that sort of actually leads into another question I had, which was, I don't know if it is just me, but I feel like I've noticed a real revival in the focus of Screamfeeder in recent years. Like, we've had the publication of the 33 and a third book on Kitten Licks. Wonderful book, by the way, to anyone who might be listening. And it just feels as though, while you guys were never necessarily overlooked by Australian music history, it feels like you're sort of getting the respect and recognition that has sort of been a little bit overdue in a way. Do you feel that way at all? Or do you just sort of are you relatively objective and just think, I'm just in the driver's seat?
Well, it's nice for you to say that we're getting the recognition that we're due. I mean, that's a sweet thing to say. And it's also amazing that an album that's, pushing 30 years old itself is still cared about by people. That's amazing. That's super cool to me. I'm pretty proud of that album. And, we're just super lucky. And we've got a bunch of great fans. We've got people who care so much about the band and we mean so much to them. And that's, most bands in the world don't even have that. Like, most bands try and they get nowhere. And we managed to get somewhere, and it's just like, holy shit, we did it, and we're eternally grateful.
Yeah. And then, I guess, speaking of looking back as well, we're currently talking a few weeks ahead of the release of this episode, but you just announced a new album full of demos, which you touched on before. So obviously demos can be scrappy at times, but it's rare that a band promotes a record, a collection, compilation, or whatever as all filler, no killer. So obviously, though, you guys see a real value in these recordings, and you hope the fans do as well. But for you, what do you hear and what do you feel when you listen back to these recordings? Do you sort of feel a sense of of energy and optimism, or do you just sort of feel like we were really onto something back then?
It's so funny because there's so many different songs. Like, there's over 100 songs going to be on the collection. So a lot of them I listen to and go, oh, that's kind of inspiring and cool. We never did anything with it. It's actually probably more the songs that never got recorded and released ever, like the ones that were just left as demos. They're the ones that excite me the most because they're like, wow, that was actually way better than we ever gave it credit for, and we could have done something with it, but we didn't need to or want to. And then you've got the songs, probably about maybe say 35% of the songs are songs that people will know, like the songs that ended up on albums or as singles. And honestly, those demos are slightly less inspiring to me. I mean, they're very interesting because they're slightly different versions of the songs. The singing might be different. The lyrics might be different. The tempo might be different, anything like that. But they're slightly less exciting. They're the less exciting ones for me.
Have you therefore considered maybe, these ones that are pretty good that never on the album, should we maybe re-record these, or are they just going to be left in the past?
It's something that, I was playing some of the music to Kellie recently, and she basically couldn't remember it or hadn't even ever heard it. And she was like, oh, that one's great, we should work on it. And I'm like, yeah, okay, let's do that. But you know what? It probably won't happen because we'd probably just rather go in fresh and just push all that shit off the table and be done with it and just come up with new stuff.
Completely fair. And I guess as a bit of a last question of this main segment, a full recording schedule means I'm recording this episode before you guys head out on tour with Blue Bottle Kiss, but it won't be released until slightly afterwards. So while I'd love to maintain the illusion by saying, hey, Tim, how are those shows you just did? I'm instead going to ask, what does, I guess next year look like for you guys? I know there's some shows in New Zealand, but is there anything major on the cards at this stage?
No, I mean, apart from the New Zealand stuff in February, that's all we've got booked. So I probably assume that we will, we might after New Zealand have a slight break from practice because at the moment we're going to practice every week, but then we might reconvene and start writing some new stuff, just farting around, no pressure, just jamming, experimenting in the studio again because we've had Phil drumming for us for a couple of years now, and when I was at practice last night, was listening to him, and he's now at the point where he's fully into the vibe of the band and getting all the songs and able to give himself to the songs, because for a long time he was playing in a way that he, was basically servicing the songs. He was doing them what they needed to do and doing them justice and playing them as they were recorded. So now I feel he's slipped down a level into that zone of being really someone who's enjoying the songs and giving himself to the songs. So that's fantastic. And it means that when we go to create music, we'll all be in, it'll be no one holding back.
And that must be a nice feeling as well, to not only have some time off, but to then also say, you know what, we're all on the same page, we're all thinking alike, we're all in step.
Yeah.
And whatever happens, happens.
Yeah. And so this has been a nuts busy year for all of us. Like, I've had this demos project, which I still haven't even finished. Like, I'm still slaving away on it. And we did a bunch of shows in the first half of the year. And what else? Been doing the podcast, been doing everything. So I'm really flattened with all the work. But next year I plan to just do a little less, but enjoy it a little more.
Be able to put your feet up at long last.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think we should get down to the portion of the podcast from which its namesake is derived. So Trusty Chord sees me follow the 1, 3, and 5 structure of a standard chord, and I ask you about one artist that's impacted you, 3 albums that have influenced you, and 5 songs you can always turn to. And these albums and songs don't need to be by your one artist either. So it's a bit wordy in its explanation, but I'm persisting nonetheless. So my first question for you here, Tim, who is, I guess, the one artist that's inspired you the most, whether it be personally or creatively?
Wow. Well, I think if I was to look at the whole, lifespan of the band, I'd probably really actually just have to come back to Husker Du, because they were the band because I was really into punk in the early 80s, and punk was sort of, in England at least, kind of crawling up its own arse a little bit. But then in America, it was getting much more experimental, but I hadn't heard all that stuff. And then when I discovered Husker Du, it's like the 2 elements of music that I love the most got married to each other. It's like the beautiful skilled pop melody, hook writing, and the ferocity and energy and spark of punk. And it was just like, oh my God, that is the new way. That's the way forward. And I guess for everyone around the world in the scene at that point, they were a huge inspiration and a opening of a door. And they put out like however many albums, 6, 7, whatever it was, and they're almost all killer, no filler, like all the way through. They're fantastic, and they've got a certain magic to them. And a band also with 2 songwriters is always great. And like, I was always a Bob Mould guy, and then I'm suddenly like going, oh my God, Grant Hart's just like the freaking genius of the band.
Absolutely. I mean, for anyone listening, just beforehand, before we recorded, we were talking about my band, and one of the songs we're currently playing is a Husker Du song.
Which song?
We're just always throwing it. It's the standard, don't want to know if you're lonely. Yeah. It's the one that everyone would know. But we're always throwing that in the set, and as a result of doing that, I've really gone back and sort of like deconstructed a lot of their songwriting, just to sort of get in that mindset, because I like to actually get in the mindset of an artist if I sort of cover a song, and it's just so fascinating to look at how they write songs. It's just it's so surprisingly poppy, but it's not in any way like seen as a pop band at all.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Like, I love like Bob Mould's songs. You can almost predict what they're going to do at any point, and that he's got a certain amount of chords that he's not going to bust out of that in that song, and it's like very workmanlike again. Like it's got this sort of work ethic thing you can really smell around it. And Grant Hart's songs are just playful and magical and poetic and sweet and simple and amazing. Like he's the magic. He's the sort of fairy dust on the cake,
Yeah, absolutely. Now, my next question is, what are 3 albums that have impacted you the most? This could be albums that you're always throwing on, or something that was integral to your musical evolution.
That's such a hard question. And I know the next one is going to be even harder. So 3 albums. Well, I guess one would be, say, Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols, because it was the album that really opened that door for me and invited me into that world of punk and rock and roll. And I find that even when I put it on now, which I do, I love the playing, I love the songs. I find it a faultless album. Like every beat, every phrase, every guitar lick, I fucking love. And it's amazing. It's a fantastic rock and roll record. And, it references the past, it references The Who and stuff like that. And it just puts a template on the table for great rock and roll moving forward. So I love that album. Yeah.
It's been said so many times, but it's an album that is really just ahead of its time. Like, to listen to it and just think this was coming out at that time, and
Yeah.
it's still influencing artists today.
Yeah. It's
I mean,
amazing.
we're almost 50 years down the line, and it's still
Yeah.
with that influence. It's amazing, truly.
It is. Yeah. The next one I'd say would be the Hold Steady's first album, Almost Killed Me, which came out in about, I think it was like '05, something like that. It came out. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it, literally sitting here looking at my arms goosebumping up, because I remember the first time I heard it, I was at a friend's place in Adelaide. These guys I knew used to live in a church, and we rocked around because we stayed with them, and they put it on for us nice and loud. And the guy who's my friend, this guy Dylan, was playing me this record. He says, "You got to hear this, you got to hear this." And he put it on nice and loud. And he was just looking at me throughout the whole record, wide-eyed, quoting every other line of lyrics and just laughing and going, "Hey, is this the most amazing thing you've ever heard?" And I was going, "Oh my God, it is the most amazing thing I've ever heard." And honestly, that album, I could not stop listening to for like 2 years. I couldn't even listen to any other music for 2 years. Like, once you've heard that album and it moves you, every other album pales in comparison, apart from, Pistols album maybe. But when, that album is like this rock and roll punk record with amazing lyrics, amazing vocal delivery, band sounds killer. It's just captured this young, naive band in this amazing way, and it blew my mind.
I'm thinking of it just now, and just how they've got Positive Jam as the opening song on there, and just hearing Craig Finn's voice. I mean, he's got a very unique voice, but he works so well, and his lyrics are just truly, truly amazing. They in a weird way, they always remind me of a punk version of the band The Mountain Goats.
Oh yeah.
Not sure if you're across the Mountain Goats at all, but again, an example of a sort of almost like a folky band with some rock influences, singing with a bit of a nasal voice. But to me, it's the poetry that's at play. It grabs you and just doesn't let you go.
Yeah,
it holds steady, so to speak.
Yes. He's amazing, and he does hold everything together around himself. But the band just sounds fantastic, and it's a shame because I love that album so much, and the next one's pretty amazing as well. But honestly, every subsequent album, I'm disappointed by it, and it saddens me so deeply. And every time they put out an album, I'm like, all right, I'm going to listen to it. And I listen to it, and I almost always hate the production. And I always find that there's probably 25% of the songs are good, and I would go back to them. And I'm so conflicted over it. Like it's like loving someone and hating them at the same time.
Yeah, it's sad, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's really hard to gel with. And what was your third album, Tim?
Wow, third album. God, such a hard question. I'm going to go for the Rolling Stones' Beggar's Banquet. Kind of grew up on it when I left home in Townsville and I was living in share houses and stuff. It was always on repeat the whole time. And I've actually just listened to this super long, like 3-hour podcast about it. So I'm all over what happened around it and stuff like that. But I'm not the world's biggest Stones fan by any means. Like, I find him really patchy, but that album was just a very, very big peak. It was a high point where they just came back from the psychedelic thing, and they just, simplified, went for a more bluesy kind of vibe. And every song's awesome, and the performance is fantastic. And it just, as a whole album, it's extremely convincing.
It was actually an album that took me a very long time to come around to. I mean, I've listened to the whole discography over the years, but I don't think it was actually until I heard Rage Against the Machine covering Street Fighting Man that I actually sort of realized, hang on, that song is so much better than I always gave it credit for. I'd always hear it on the radio, and then revisiting it, and I realized this is actually a really strong album. I mean,
it's great, yeah.
I feel like it sort of gets overshadowed by Sympathy for the Devil sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's a brilliant, brilliant album.
Some of the just mid-side tracks, some of the B-side tracks and stuff, like Salt of the Earth and Parachute Woman and stuff, they're fantastic. They're beautiful songs.
Truly. Absolutely, truly. So lastly, I'd love to know the 5 songs you can always turn to, whether it be for comfort, for excitement, anything at all, your 5 trusty songs. And this is the hard question.
It really is. I'm going to have to just pick them as they come to me rather than just try and formulate like an actual perfect list. So 5 songs. Okay, let me think. Well, I'll say a Hold Steady song because, I can't not, having cited the album. So I'll probably say Killer Parties. You know, the closing track on that album is one of my favorite 5 songs ever. I'll have to say a Clash song, and I won't pick something obvious because also, you know, I grew up on the Clash and love them deeply. There's a song on Sandinista called Something About England, and it's a Mick Jones song, and it's a very beautiful, soft. Oh, actually, you know what? I'm not going to say that song. I'm going to say a different song by the Clash. It's the last song on Combat Rock, and it's called "Death Is a Star," and it's this really light, whispered, jazzy, kind of plinky plonky piano, shuffly song about basically smoking in a cinema and watching these films, and it's just a really unique moment for the band. Joe's voice is really fragile, and Mick joins in, and he's really fragile too. And if there's one thing I love, it's Mick Jones's voice. He's got the most awesome voice ever. And so that song, every time I listen to it, I've got to listen to it again straight away, and it's just super evocative and very fragile in every way. Like the song's almost not there, and it's about to fall apart, and it's got something magical for me. Yeah.
And it's also like a very sort of like not strange but differently styled like song compared to the rest of the album, which can be very forceful, and it's got a lot of like, you know, good hits on there. I mean, Straight to Hell, you know, Rock the Casbah, things like that. Then a moment like that which really resonates for a closer, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you know it. Wow.
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Clash. But yeah, it's I mean, that's a brilliant album. That's a brilliant closer as well.
Yeah. So how many is that I've done?
That's 2 already.
I think that I think I would have to put a Smith song in there. Just let me look up what's on Queen is Dead, because I reckon it's going to be on something on the Queen is Dead. Hang on one sec. I think it would be Never Had No One Ever. Yeah, like track 5. That's a super beautiful, sad song. Total pure Smith's magic. Yeah, I think I would have to go for that song.
That's also one that not many people actually. I mean, it's not exactly a hit, so to speak.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's I mean, that's a great song. I mean, for me that's probably the peak of the Smiths in terms of their output.
Yeah.
And yeah, even it's a great example of even those sort of album tracks, so to speak, are just so brilliant. They've done such great work.
I'm sure there's so many albums that I've got that are much more modern that I'm struggling to just, you know, think of off the top of my head, which have fantastic songs. But what was the one I was going to say? There's a Cure song on one of their weirder albums called The Top, and the song is called, let me just double check, because this song was a huge song for me for years. The album is my favorite Cure album. Yeah, I think the song's Dressing Up. It's just a weird album song off this album, The Top, and it's just, I think that album, Robert Smith more or less did the whole album himself, and it's just got this naive sort of, you know, you can sense that he wasn't caring about anything external. Like he didn't care about making a single off the record. I don't think there are any hit singles on the record. He was just indulging in himself and just being his kooky, sweet, you know, weird, lovely self.
Yeah, I think from memory, the only song off that album that was a single was "The Caterpillar," I think.
Yeah,
and even then, that's not. I don't even think that one's, you know, considered one of their greatest hits, so to speak.
Definitely not.
Yeah, that's an album of theirs I've never really listened to too much actually, but I think after knowing, you know, have this recommendation from yourself today, I think I may need to go back and revisit it.
I can't believe it's so old. Like it's 40 years old. It's just nuts.
Because it's in that sort of that little sweet spot between like Japanese Whispers and A Head on the Door, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
It's this sort of like weird part where it's like both sides are quite well remembered, but the top doesn't sort of
I probably like Head on the Door almost as much, or if not more, as an album. Like it's pretty fantastic, but like the Top album just sort of holds a little place in my heart, really.
Of course.
Yeah.
And I think we've got one song left.
I guess I should actually put a Spiritualized song in there, because I'm a pretty big Spiritualized fan. Even though sort of like the whole steady, I find myself conflicted because, you know, at least a third of their songs I kind of sail past, find a touch boring, but the ones that I love insanely, and I just can play on repeat all day and just find myself sinking into. So there's there's stuff's all very similar. So probably something like Always Together With You off the most recent album. Just I love his melodic stuff. I love his gospel-y, slower stuff, and his fragility and his sometimes kooky lyrics and very heartfelt, honest sort of. Even though they might not make the greatest lyric, you can tell that the sentiment is overriding everything, and it's just really beautiful.
I've always felt as though Jason is a very underrated songwriter.
Mm.
Like, I mean, he's never sort of like listed in like the great songwriters or the great musicians. But I really feel like he should be, because I mean, I've never really sort of listened to much of Spiritualized. I mean, later stuff, their recent work. I've more sort of focused on the stuff in the '90s, but yeah, the stuff from today, it holds up very well.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
His talent hasn't waned at all.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, he's very pure talent. Like, he's not going to go anywhere real soon. He's not going to change what he does. Yeah.
Well, speaking of pure talent, I should say, Tim Steward, I wanted to say thank you very much for taking the time today to have a chat.
Thank you. That was fun. That was really good.
Thank you for listening to Trusty Chords. If you listened to this episode and enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you were able to take a few moments to like, follow, share, and review this podcast on your preferred platform of choice. As always, no obligation, but I'm forever grateful if you do. As always, I'm over on Instagram and Facebook at Trusty Chords Podcast, all one word. There's also a blog on my website, which is tylerjenke.com, that's tylerjenke/Trusty Chords Podcast, all one word. You know by now what you can find on their site, but you can also find a link to the Buy Me a Coffee platform where you can throw me a few dollars to keep this podcast running, if you feel so inclined. Lastly, I need to thank Tim Steward for spending time with me this week for the podcast, and I also need to thank Chris Hamilton for helping organise this chat as well. But once again, thank you kindly for listening, and I hope to see you all again next week as I continue to celebrate music and those that create it.